Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding this hearing. I would hope that as we discuss violent extremism, that one thing that we could all agree on is that it is wrong and dangerous for any political actor and certainly any executive administration to try to leverage the threat of violent extremism to mislead Congress, to go after political opponents, or to threaten the speech and First Amendment rights of law-abiding citizens. But unfortunately, that is exactly what the Biden administration has done. And we have new insight into that today because of the actions of a patriotic whistleblower who contacted my office along with Senator Grassley a short time ago and provided to us documents from the Department of Homeland Security relating to that agency's disinformation board that Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas testified about sitting right there just a few weeks ago. But according to the documents that I have in my hand here that Senator Grassley and I have now made public, the testimony that Secretary Mayorkas gave to this committee, under oath, I might add, was in many respects deeply misleading. Deeply misleading. And the information we've now learned about the administration's efforts to track and censor American speech is deeply shocking. And I'd like to take a moment to go through with this whistleblower, who I thank for that person's patriotism, to go through what these documents disclose. You know, Secretary Mayorkas said that the efforts of the department with the disinformation board were new in response to my questions about whether there were documents, meeting minutes, other documents related to the disinformation board. He suggested that there weren't any because the board hadn't met. Well, in fact, we now know that the Department of Homeland Security began working on standing up this board as early as last year. In a memorandum dated September 13th, 2021, the Undersecretary of DHS writes to the Secretary, to Mayorkas, about the need for the disinformation board. And here's the interesting thing. They explicitly cite domestic violent extremism as a reason to stand up the censorship board, but it quickly goes far beyond that. In the same paragraph, they talk about the need for this disinformation board to monitor and to counter so-called disinformation about the COVID vaccine, about people who are raising question about the efficacy of masks, about people who are raising questions about the origins of COVID. So, in other words, the Department of Homeland Security is contemplating a disinformation board that will track the speech of Americans and classify it as disinformation if you raise a question about the COVID vaccine, about the origins of COVID, about the efficacy of masks, which, by the way, this administration has reversed itself on numerous times. The documents go on. The disinformation board is necessary, this memorandum says, because of those who question election integrity, because of those who have questions about January 6th. So now we get to the nub of it. We see that, in fact, this disinformation board from the beginning was meant to track and go after political speech that this administration did not favor. And for an executive department to do that, and frankly to mislead this committee about it, is deeply, deeply disturbing, and it's wrong. I mean, it's just plain wrong. As we look through the documents, you see that what the Secretary told the committee about the disinformation board's operation is just not true. He repeatedly told this committee that the disinformation board would be just a working group, just a working group. That's not what the documents say. There is a charter, a proposed charter, that the Secretary himself signed personally on February 24th, 2022, that describes the disinformation board as having the authority to set up guidelines. It has governance authority over how the department will classify what is disinformation, over what the response to disinformation should be, over who is doing what in terms of countering disinformation, which, remember, includes questions about COVID or questions about election integrity or questions about masks. The idea that this is just a working group is, frankly, completely contradicted by the documents that the whistleblower turned over to us and that the Secretary himself signed. And can I just say again, for the secretary to sit in that chair and tell me that he wasn't really aware of any documents related to the Disinformation Board when he has personally signed charters, when he has personally reviewed memoranda dating back months, is misleading at best. There's also information in these documents about attempted coordination, planned coordination by the Disinformation Board with the big tech monopolies. There are meeting notes here, proposed plans of actions for members of the Disinformation Board, members of the administration, to meet with big tech executives to discuss sharing information about disinformation and tracking analytics of American citizens who are using the big tech companies' platforms and engaging in so-called misinformation. This is a big tech administration alliance to track speech. It's here in the documents. Now, I asked Secretary Mayorkas if there had been any contact with the big tech companies. He said he wasn't aware of any. I sent a letter following his testimony to Secretary Mayorkas, putting this question to him directly. And interestingly, the department's draft responses to my letter are also in these documents. Now, I'll say for the record, the department has not yet officially responded, but their draft responses are here in the whistleblower documents, and they continue the misleading half-truths. They continue in those documents to characterize this as a working group. False. I say, has the DHS conferred with any private social media company in the operation of this board? They repeat the idea that the board is merely an internal working group, and then they say the creation of the board was not discussed with any external entities. That's because we now know that they were discussing the operation of the board with big tech companies. They were seeking to partner and get analytics on law-abiding Americans. Mr. Chairman, my time has nearly expired. I would ask unanimous consent that my letter with Senator Grassley, along with the attachments, be entered into the record.
Without objection. We haven't reviewed any of those documents, but without objection.
This is startling information. This committee needs to hold a hearing to follow up on the testimony that the Secretary gave on the inconsistencies that we now find in these documents, and on, frankly, this administration's concerted efforts to mislead the American public about its own attempts to track and censor and, frankly, punish American speech, which is deeply antithetical to the First Amendment, deeply antithetical to our constitutional principles, and deeply wrong. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.